Welcome to episode 3 of Positively Geared. My name is Alex Augustiniak, and today's topic is location. We've established Lloyd Edge's success in property investment in previous podcasts. Lloyd attributes location to being one of the most important aspects to successfully investing in property. We will be discussing this topic in great detail today and encompassing location and the importance of it in building a successful portfolio of investment properties. Hello, Lloyd.
Hi, Alex. How are you going?
Very well. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Episode location.
Looking forward to it. Great conversation to have.
So I suppose the topic probably gives away what we're going to be discussing over the next 45 minutes or so. It's basically, the cornerstone of property investment, finding a good location to buy in or invest in.
Absolutely. So, we've previously discussed strategy, know your why and all that kind of stuff. And now it's really about how to find a good location and what makes a good location. And it's not just about getting the right city or the right suburb within that city or even the right street. Location also comes down to the position of the house within the street. And there's a lot of things to go into as well.
And why is location important?
Location is really important because some properties simply perform better than others, and it's simply because of what this topic is called, because of location. So location is really important. So on a very macro level, you need to be buying properties that are near near the amenities, near things like shopping centres, cafes. They need to be near the transport. If they're near hospitals, near universities, that's all really good. You need to buy properties in places where people want to live, and that really helps. Be able to tenant them out as investment properties. It's really important to be buying in areas that do have those low vacancy rates and everything like that. And also, I think one of the things about buying in a good location is to ensure that as an investor, you're still buying in a location that is actually driven by owner-occupiers. So you don't want to be buying in an investment-driven area, because investors are the kinds of people that pay less for properties because they want to bargain all the time. Owner-occupiers actually drive growth because they're more emotional. And eventually, when you sell your property, you don't want to sell it to an investor. You want to sell it to an owner-occupier, somebody who's going to live there. So that's important as well. So getting the right suburb from that perspective, is very important as well. A lot of things with location comes down to investment grade properties, and less than 5% of properties in Australia are actually investment grade, and that comes down to a lot of the things I've just mentioned. And also, you don't want to be buying on, say, a busy road. It should be on a quiet street, and then the floor plan of the property and the actual FSR, the floor space ratio of the house to the land value, is also important. Of course, buying away from flood zones and flight paths and all those kind of issues are also very important.
So let's just recap that statistic you just gave us. 5% of all properties within Australia are considered investment grade. Is that correct?
Yes, actually less than 5%.
Less than 5%.
And the thing is there, and that just basically means that there's a whole heap of properties that you can buy. And when you think of it, 750,000 properties at any one time are on the market in the country. So many of them don't make the grade there, really. They don't
meet the brief.
Yeah, don't meet the brief. Yeah. They're not located well.
And I think, that statistic is very, very important because it just, I think, in my mind, reaffirms the importance of aligning yourself with a quality buyer's agent or somebody like yourself that has vast experience in investing, because, we look at the opportunity cost of buying, for example, an investment in a great suburb with good yield and good amenities and everything you've just covered off on, versus buying in an area which has possibly negative growth. It's possibly a regional area where there's not high demand for jobs and infrastructure. If we're to measure those two purchases over a 2 to 5 and 10 year period, both those are going to perform very differently. So, that really underpins the rationale behind honing on great quality locations.
That's exactly what it's about. And really, Alex, it's really about finding a property that's going to outperform the averages. Because if you want the same results that everybody else is getting, then you do the same thing as everybody else, which is often buy without a strategy. Buy a property. One of the mistakes people make is buy a property close to where they live because they think that they can check on it. And that's, you can't drive past a property and really check on it. It's not really a particularly good strategy there, because that's why you have a property manager, to be able to look after your property. You need to be buying in those best locations, because those properties that are located in desirable areas are the ones that people actually want to live. What that actually means is that tenants pay a premium and the properties sell for a premium. Now, there's always the argument that you need to pay a bit more for that property as well. You're not going to get as higher vendor discounts when you're buying those properties as you might for some others. But at the end of the day, you've got to look at those long-term goals. And, if you're buying a property that is really desirable, it's in a nice, quiet street. And, I've lived on some really noisy roads in the past, and I'd hate to be owning properties on those kind of streets, because cities like Sydney and Melbourne, when the market really peaks, almost anything can sell. Properties really sell themselves. But the thing is that when the property market's cool, then those properties that are not particularly well located, they just don't sell.
Nobody wants to touch them.
Nobody will touch them. Yeah, it's the ones that are well located that actually sell better and that'll actually hold their value better.
Sure. What impresses me most, Lloyd, about your story and your business and your experience, and a lot of this is covered off in your book, Positively Geared, is that you have not only built this portfolio and advise clients, in a geographically centric location. So it's not as though all your work's done in Sydney. You've got experience in all the states, different capital cities. There are trends between some of them. For example, Sydney and Melbourne are often mentioned in the same sentence, but you've also got experience in other major capital cities in the country. And I think for you, that allows you to have a more holistic approach to the advice you give your clients. And I think that is a real game changer. And that's probably, a real unique point for the services that you can provide and the advice that you're giving to people listening today. You mentioned just before that, it's really important to sort of detach yourself from the need to necessarily purchase where you live, which I think is probably one of the more cliche or stigmas that we see attached to a lot of people looking to invest. They want to buy nearby. In terms of, I suppose, looking at location, we've looked at it from face value. Let's dig a bit deeper. What exactly, beyond obviously looking for areas that have good economic growth, are full of amenities, what exactly would you be looking for if you were buying a property today? And what would you be advising anybody listening to this podcast that they really need to hone in on?
Okay, there's a couple of good points there. One of them is, firstly, you need to really look at things on a macro level. So we look at the whole country, and you've mentioned sort of other states. So I personally don't recommend Perth, for example, or Darwin, simply because they're too reliant on the resources sector. So we've had, in fact, if you look at the statistics between 2010 to 2020, house price growth, the cities of Perth and Darwin actually had negative growth, and the only two cities that had negative growth, because that was on the back of the resources sector. So therefore, with that sort of instability, I wouldn't be recommending looking there. So I wouldn't really go any further with those cities. Take a place like Adelaide. That's not a bad place to be investing, but it's quite, it's quite stable. So it doesn't really boom and doesn't really bust. So it's a very safe place to put your money. Then if we look at a place like Tasmania, that a lot of people have been talking about in recent years, it did go through a couple of years of a lot of increase in prices, but that's essentially because a lot of the other markets were declining, and Hobart particularly had quite low prices to begin with, along with high yields that was driving a lot of people to invest down there. But the thing about that is what I see down there is not enough government investment, not enough population growth. So one of the things, and that was a little bit of a long-winded way of getting to my point, which is one of the things I really need to look at is the growth in a certain area in terms of jobs growth, population growth, government investment. So we look at, say, Sydney and Melbourne, then we know that there's a lot of migration coming in. they're both very strong economies. So it's either New South Wales or Victoria that are sort of fighting each other for whoever has the strongest economy. Queensland, not so much. Brisbane has a little bit too much development and a release of land, to keep up. It's just a little bit too much supply up there to keep up with the demand. So it's not quite as good a place. Although a lot of people really spook about Brisbane, I don't have quite the confidence in there that a lot of people do. You need to have a careful strategy when you go into a market like that. If you've got a strategy where you can add some value to your properties, then that's a little bit different. But from a purely investment grade and growth point of view, you need to be pretty careful about what areas you invest in, because you don't want to be investing in the inner city suburbs and buying units or townhouses in a market that's really oversupplied. Because, as you know, Alex, the thing about real estate is you need to be buying in markets where there's scarcity. That's one thing to look at on a macro level. Then on a micro level, what people need to actually understand is that each city has its own micro markets. So Australia as a whole is not one property market, but then Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, they're not just one market either. So you've got micro markets within capital cities. So what we need to look for is the trends and the growth drivers within those capital cities. So that, I'd be really looking at what's happening in the growth trends within those cities. And while referencing the capitals, there's also a few other places that I invest that are also doing very well. For example, Wollongong, it's currently the third most expensive city in Australia behind Sydney and Melbourne. So it's a very expensive city and it's had a lot of growth. So that's something to consider. Newcastle is another market that's done quite well. It's close to Sydney. So we can consider those. If you're getting the right property within those markets, that's worth considering as well. So it's not just about the capitals, particularly for people who may not have the budget to buy in a capital. Then you can balance it out by buying in something that's close to a capital, and of course some of those markets also have slightly higher rental yields as well.
It's interesting just to hear Wollongong being the third most expensive city beyond Sydney and Melbourne. That's correct.
Yes,
that's right. Yeah. So that to me, and referencing Newcastle also, we've identified the trend that there are a lot of people in the last few years that have deemed Sydney unaffordable. And it sounds like they're looking at other areas of Australia. However, the trend is that they're obviously still wanting to maintain work in Sydney or, within New South Wales. So it's interesting that we're seeing more people hone in on, major cities outside of the CBD and metropolitan Sydney, and they're actually branching out there before they're looking at, Brisbane or Adelaide. They're very much wanting to stay in Sydney or on the periphery. In terms of what that means for investing or even for a primary residence, does having that knowledge alter the advice that you're often giving to anybody that's looking to build a portfolio? For example, we sort of just touched on Brisbane before, and you mentioned that you've got to be a bit more careful about possibly investing in inner city suburbs there at the moment due to the whole supply-demand dynamic. Do you think you get more confidence recommending a client to buy in a Newcastle or Wollongong, or is it just really dependent on a whole variety of factors?
Look, definitely. It all comes back down to strategy, of course. We've seen a lot of growth in the Newcastle Central Coast areas in recent years, and a lot of that is because people are priced out of the Sydney market. People are moving to the north, to Central Coast, and also to Newcastle to both invest and to live for lifestyle reasons. And of course, as you've said, they'll live there and then still commute to Sydney for work. So that's that gives me a lot of confidence. I've invested in properties. I still own properties in Newcastle myself, so I've got confidence in that market, for example. It does come back to that strategy, and that's one of the things that I talk to people about who, they're worried that they can't get a foot on the ladder and it's so expensive to buy in Sydney. And, we've touched in previous podcasts about, buying in perhaps some outer suburbs where they're a bit cheaper and things like that. But one of the things that I also talk about and suggest to a client to buy in Newcastle, for example, because the price point's much cheaper, but it's still got strong rental yields. And the growth is quite good there still because it's still pretty close to Sydney and everything. So it's definitely a strategy worth considering. Then you just got to be getting into the right suburb in the area. So you can't just sort of just think of Newcastle as a whole and buy in any random suburb. So you really look, okay, we want to buy a blue chip suburb, maybe try to buy within 5 or 6 k's from the city, or we might look at buying within 10 or 12 k's out from the city and doing perhaps a development or something there. But there's definitely a strategy behind everything. But because of the price point, then it's really handy for people to be able to look at those kind of markets, and they have better yield, because Sydney's got the lowest yields in the country. So we always need to look at that in terms of people's strategy. But it's certainly a way of people getting into the market as well.
It's really good conversation we're having now, because we're sort of uncovering a lot of, I think, the roadblocks that stop people from knowing where to put their money. And I think the biggest challenge for investors, whether they're seasoned or mum and dad investors, is where do we put our money? Trying to predict markets, which market's going to yield the greatest return within the shortest period of time, is sort of the tangent I think most people go down. And obviously we've touched previously on having a strategy, not just for short term, but a longer term approach to investment. In terms of looking to invest out of Sydney, I think the biggest fear or pain point for a lot of people that are listening today is the fear of possibly, what if buying in those locations doesn't necessarily yield the growth they want within the period of time they want. So how do you normally deal with that and give confidence behind looking, whether it's Newcastle or Wollongong, to people that are looking to get started?
Construction loan there.
They don't quite have the capital to invest in Sydney, but they're also fearful that, they might not necessarily achieve their goals branching out. So just that fear of buying out of area.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really important things is, coming back to what I've said before, is having a lot of economic drivers for growth in the area. So, and because we're talking about Newcastle, I can use that as an example. It's got the university there. It's got the hospital there, the John Hunter Hospital. There's even a round of the V8 touring car championships that are there now as well. So there's those kind of things that have been brought to town. There's also the light rail up there. So it's been a bit of a construction zone there. Here I am thinking about finance. Yeah. It's been a bit of a construction zone there in recent years, a bit like Sydney. But that's now they've got the light rail in there. So all that infrastructure is really improved and stuff like that. So it really comes down to making sure that we're not buying in an area that's only driven by one thing. So I'll go back to that. One of those first properties I bought, it's in Blackwater. It's driven by the mining. The mining collapses. The miner moves out of town, company leaves, there's no one to get the property. That's not going to happen in Newcastle now. Years ago, when BHP left Newcastle, people thought that was just going to, the town was going to collapse, but it actually came into its own. It's got one of the largest coal ports in the world, and it's done remarkably well. So it's become a major city. It's on the coast, and it's got some very expensive properties there and everything as well. So people can be confident that if they're investing in something that has a lot of growth drivers, that they should do quite well. But they still got to buy well-located properties. So there's no point buying properties that are, areas where there's too much supply, like on the very outskirts, or whether it's, it's not near the shops, or you got to walk 2 k's to get to a bus or something like that. It's not going to help you. So you've got to look at the micro markets and the best suburbs to invest in that are actually near those amenities. If you're buying around the hospital or the university, they're always good. And from that perspective, I'm not suggesting that you would have students of the university renting your house, but what you would do is maybe have doctors who are coming to the town and working at the hospital for a year, and they could be tenants in your property and things like that, who are sort of posted to Newcastle to work. So you're getting high quality tenants if you've got well located properties and things. Let's
tie in location with strategy. We'll just briefly touch on the two in the same conversation. And an interesting statistic I read, and I'm really drawing on your expertise on this topic, is that you mentioned previously that Sydney has the lowest yields in the country. I saw a statistic, I think it was around 2019 July August, where it basically said that Sydney, while its yields are very poor, will generally outperform most markets for capital growth. How does that impact at all the advice you would give people depending on what their investment strategy is?
Yes, always. Now, Sydney, and I always tell people that they should always own a property in Sydney at some point. Sydney and even Melbourne, places that people should own property. The problem with that is that you'll have a lot of growth in Sydney, but if it's got very low yields, people may not be able to service loans, for example, and they'll be very negative geared. So we look back at that strategy, what people are trying to achieve. If they're going to be stuck with negatively geared properties, that's what's going to keep them in a job rather than help them actually reach their goals. One of the strategies really are to maybe invest in areas that have higher yields, which could be a Brisbane, could be a Newcastle, for example, could even be a Wollongong, and then get better yields, get better cash flow into the bank, grow some equity, and then invest into Sydney. One of the problems I find that if people want to invest in Sydney straight up is they might be using all their borrowing power and all their cash deposit, and then they're going to have low yields, so they're going to sort of struggle a little bit. I call it the sleep at night factor. People are going to be negatively geared, and it's like, can I afford this? If they've got they bought a $900,000 apartment, it's only returning $600 a week, and they've got to find the balance there. That can stress people out a bit. So that's where the strategy comes into play. Rather than people often come to me and they say, yeah, I want to buy a property in Sydney because it's the best place to have property. But we really need to look at that strategy long term as well. And there's better ways to achieve that, because you could just buy that one property and then you're stuck and not be able to find your way into a second property. And you're better off to actually have a strategy to build a portfolio that helps you achieve your dreams by looking at both growth and cash flow and those different scenarios, rather than just thinking, okay, I'm just going to buy one property in Sydney and see how I go, because that's what a lot of people do. So yeah, definitely a conversation to have. But looking at that yield, we might look at that, buying something in Sydney as not necessarily the first purchase, but something a little bit further down the track.
Sure. So it sounds as though it is important to have holdings in Sydney or Melbourne because they are leaders in growth. However, it's not necessarily, and this is something that I think is a really good takeaway for people listening today, not necessarily having that need to get straight into those markets where you're going to be a lot more highly leveraged or not have as much flexibility with your investment, and then possibly you're tied down and effectively miss out on other opportunities.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a couple of other things. If you've got a borrowing power of, say, 1.5 million, I wouldn't necessarily say go buy one property in Sydney. I'd say, well, you could probably buy 3 properties in Brisbane, or one in Newcastle and 2 in Brisbane, and diversify. I wouldn't, by the way, suggest just buy 3 properties in Brisbane either, but you could buy sort of 3 properties instead of putting all your money in one basket, so to speak. Diversification is quite important as well. And then another thing that comes into strategy is also land tax. So if you buy all your properties in the one area, or you spend all your money on just one expensive property, then you might reach the land tax threshold, and that's not going to assist you, because you want to be sort of looking at diversifying interstate for that reason, as well as to mitigate your risk. Of course, that's where a conversation with the accountant comes in handy, because you'll be looking at the different entities to buy, and because whether you're going to be buying your own personal name, whether you're going to be buying in a trust of some sort. But then, of course, you need to look at the different tax implications with that, and what the actual strategy is, how long you're going to hold the property for, whether you're going to be holding it and distributing the income to your kids through a discretionary trust, or whether you're going to be selling the property. There's a lot of things to consider, which all goes in as part of that strategy. So, there's a lot more to what we do than just, we're going to buy property for you.
So let's spend some time in looking at the micro factors of location. Identifying great pockets of metropolitan or regional areas to invest money into. What are some of the markers that you look for when investing? I mean, I'll give you the example. I generally find in my experience that you are better off to purchase possibly properties that do require a lot of work, just because there's less emotive value, and in areas we mentioned previously where there's a high owner-occupier mix, generally people will pay a premium to secure a holding in those suburbs, whereas most people still tend to trend towards turnkey properties, whether they're occupying or investing. Do you see any benefit in purchasing properties that need that work? Or how do you see that whole dynamic?
I definitely always see a benefit to purchasing properties that need some work, need some TLC, because that's my strategy of adding some value. Now, not everybody sort of sees it. Some people think, I just want a property that doesn't need any work. However, we're not really talking about rundown properties that can't be lived in. We're sort of talking about maybe properties that are a bit dated. And what you could do is, rip up the carpets and put down some floorboards, do a paint job, put in new window coverings, update the kitchen and the bathroom, whatever, at some stage. don't even need to do that necessarily straight away, but you can get those properties that maybe more within your budget in really good areas, and upgrading them actually not only improves the value of the property, but also the rental yield of the property. Another reason I recommend sort of buying older properties is that quite often you'll get a potentially better value on them, certainly than you would if you're buying something like off the plan or something like that. So and that's probably a conversation for another day, but certainly that's where you can have some good value there. The other thing also is it's very important to consider the type of property you're buying for the demographics. So once you find the right location, you've got to buy the right property within that location. For example, you don't want to be buying a one-bedroom unit out in Campbelltown where everyone loves living in 4-bedroom homes, because your unit's not going to rent very well and certainly not going to get any growth. In the inner city, it's okay to be buying apartments, but I would only be buying apartments in Sydney at the moment. I wouldn't be buying apartments in Brisbane or Melbourne because they're over. They're saturated really. So from that perspective, if you're sort of in the market, generally speaking, and you want a sort of a bit of a budget, then if you're in Sydney, getting a good blue chip property, getting an apartment that's sort of near the CBD, 3 or 4 k's from the CBD or near the water, northern beaches, lower North Shore, those kind of areas are good. For getting some growth on an apartment there. In Melbourne, getting a quality townhouse is good. In Brisbane, I'd probably be staying away from units and townhouses altogether in Brisbane and just doing houses. So it depends on that, what the market's doing and the general demographic and everything like that.
Absolutely. What are some of the limiting factors that you find generally come into play in terms of location? For example, if you were to be looking to invest some money into Sydney and your budget permitted that you're likely to buy an apartment within the sort of inner city region, would that be likely the way to go, or would you consider more possibly purchasing a Torrens title home where you've got that, I suppose, flexibility to do as you can within current council regulations to the side, but possibly slightly further out? Is there any golden rule towards that in terms of location? Or
look, I think there's be a lot of advisors out there that all sort of have their own sort of little rules around that, but I don't generally have a golden rule as such, but it's about really understanding how that property is going to work, because there's nothing wrong. Some people say never buy an apartment because you should only buy houses on land, because the old adage of land appreciates and houses depreciate. But the metrics of property is not really that simple. And at the end of the day, and as an example, you could buy a 5,000 acre block with a house on it in Dubbo, and it's never going to get as much growth as a 1-bedroom apartment in the middle of Sydney. So that old saying doesn't really work that well. So it really is about location and where people actually want to live. But what I would be carefully considering, and I do get this question a lot with my clients, is, okay, I've got this much to invest. I really want to buy close to the city, and this is what I want to do. Or should I buy a bit further out? And quite often the recommendation might be to buy a bit further out, where we can, get a house that we can do something with. And when I say a bit further out, we're not talking about the very western suburbs. You can buy a bit further out, in the inner west suburbs and stuff, and things like that. So it's not about being a long way out, but it's about still getting into a good suburb, but maybe where you can do something a little bit more with the property. Because the other thing to think about with apartments is the cost of strata, the body corporate, and how that can eat away with your rental yields as well. In terms of location with properties, there's a lot of high-rise apartments around. They're the ones that you should be staying away from. So if you're going to be buying in an apartment building, it should be something that's a bit more of a boutique building, a bit smaller, less number of apartments, and something a little bit more special about the property that you can do something with that's going to outperform the averages and things like that. So, if you're buying in a big apartment building that's got 200 apartments and there's nothing unique about your property, so that's something to really assess in terms of location as well. And sometimes that can define, because when you're putting that alongside buying in the right street, you need to buy away from busy roads and stuff like that. You may not actually find that particular suburb has the right property for you. So you need to go to another suburb and assess the strategy and the location and the type of property you're going to get anyway.
I think a great strategy particularly in major metropolitan markets like Sydney, Melbourne, and possibly Brisbane, is the idea of hotspotting. So what we've found is that a lot of people that are looking to buy in the most popular suburbs are often, due to budget constraints, having to look in surrounding suburbs, and possibly that is a good way to sort of get a property in the area you want, which is going to perform well. However, without that as much of an initial investment.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't like the term hotspotting. I don't believe in hotspots.
Sure.
A lot of people, talk about hotspots over the years, but really, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as a hotspot. If it's got all the demographics, the right growth drivers, it'll get some growth. But a lot of the time, the problem with hotspots is that people fall for that. It's like, the next big thing, and people just move there to invest. A couple of examples of that. Gladstone. Everyone's speaking about Gladstone and how it was the best place to invest in the country. But when the coal seam gas collapsed, then properties, the market just completely collapsed there and hasn't recovered since. Toowoomba is another example. Toowoomba in southeast Queensland, another example of where it was proved to be the best investment place in the country. And then everyone started investing there, and people, developers were going there and buying up land, and builders were building, and then it just became saturated and everything like that. So you got to be really careful about that hotspotting things. I guess what you're referring to is probably what I'd call the ripple effect. So certainly buying in a suburb that's, I guess, a bridesmaid suburb in a way. So in the vicinity, maybe a couple of suburbs close to another area that has recently boomed, then you're going to be in a fairly good position to be comfortable that your property is actually going to get some good growth as well. So I do believe in that ripple effect, but again, it all comes down to those growth drivers, if it's in the right area and everything.
So it sounds like one of the key takeaways for people listening is that you really need to take a step back when evaluating location and not buy too much into hype. You've got to really assess performance over a long period of time, because that's generally should give a good indication of possible future performance.
Yeah, absolutely. So while no one's got a crystal ball, you can look at what's happened in the past, and it should be a fairly good indication of what's going to happen in the future. And I think people sometimes get excited, and because everybody, I think a lot of people think, I just don't like what I'm doing, I want to make money quickly, and just if someone says something's a hotspot, let's just go and invest there. You never really invest in a hotspot, or a so-called hotspot, and then have it like boom 6 or 12 months later and suddenly you become wealthy. It doesn't really work like that. Those hotspots actually go the other way, and they become oversaturated because everyone's going there. I think what you really need to do is, if everyone's running to invest in one particular location, you should be going the other way and investing somewhere else, basically, and doing your research. But property investing is a long-term thing. Even if you are looking to create instant equity and build a property, even if you're looking to build property and sell it, if you want to get the best returns, you need to look at the overall performance, the long-term performance of that area, and what can happen there, and what has happened there. And the future planned infrastructure is okay to look at that. But if you're looking at future planned infrastructure and what's going in there, you also need to look at how much land release is happening in the area as well, so it doesn't become too saturated. So there's a lot of things to look at as well. But yeah, certainly you need to do that homework. Sometimes people have been quite lucky. People who've owned property in Sydney and Melbourne have had some really, there's been some really bullish markets, and over the last few years, particularly since 2012, and it slowed down a bit, 2017, 2018, now it's picking back up. And it's a really, there's been a lot of growth happening. But so if anything, if there's a hotspot, it's really investing in the Sydney or Melbourne markets. Going out to regional areas that someone says is a hotspot because of something's happening there, those sort of metrics don't really make any sense.
So there we go, guys. It's really important that you don't buy into the hype of an area that's getting a lot of, I guess, media coverage, or following the crowd, so to speak. Lloyd, you've just mentioned that it's so important that if everybody seems to be going in one direction, that possibly you're best to go another way. In terms of Sydney property and Melbourne property, if we sort of deviate a bit away from there and look at other areas of the country where, people might have a bit more freedom with their budget to, build a few holdings. And then, as we mentioned before, they look to buy back into those major cities. Have you got any tips or success stories from recent investing?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's still plenty of good regional areas to invest in, and I can think of places such as Geelong or Ballarat in Victoria. You might be looking at places like even in New South Wales, Orange, Bathurst, Armidale, those kind of areas. People think of them as not getting much growth, but at the end of the day, there's actually quite a fair bit of growth in those areas, and they've got to have some of the fundamentals that I always look for, and that's driven by university, have a hospital there and things like that. And if you look over the long term, there's some good growth in those kind of areas on a cheaper budget. So you always got to look at the growth from a percentage point of view. So obviously, if you're in an area where the median house price is 250,000, then your average growth is going to be a lot lower than something that's got $1 million medium, like Sydney. So you need to look at that from a percentage point of view. But what I recommend when you go into any of those areas is don't just buy a property and hope for the best and hope you're going to get some growth. Is that you actually need to manufacture some equity there, and that's been key to my portfolio, and that's what I recommend to other people. So while you can buy in Sydney and Melbourne and get some good growth, any other market, don't just think it's going to grow in value because even Brisbane, don't think it's going to grow in value because everyone's saying Brisbane's the next place to move. I don't have the confidence in Brisbane that everyone else does. But if you go there and you do something with it, build a duplex, buy a house with a granny flat. Granny flats are great. You get really good cash flow, all that kind of stuff. Buy a house and renovate it. Those kind of things. That's adding value. And you can do that in any market, really. You can buy a house in Ballarat in Victoria and renovate the house and get some equity on it and use that equity, then go and buy another house somewhere else and build yourself up, build your portfolio up. So that's what I suggest. Don't just go buy properties anywhere and just wait for that growth, because that growth is going to be very slow coming.
So Lloyd, I think, the rewards are very obvious when you purchase in a good location. You're going to expect to achieve either a good yield or good growth, depending on what your strategy is. Let's have a conversation around buying in the wrong location, or buying in a location which at the time appealed or was appealing. However, with the benefit of hindsight, wasn't probably the right place to put your money. How do you bounce back from that? Or more to the point, how do you handle being in a situation where, and possibly some listeners are in this situation at the moment, where they own a property in an area which hasn't quite materialized in terms of the growth or yield they were expecting, and making that really confronting decision as to whether to hold or fold? How do you sort of approach that?
Yeah, and I do actually have quite a few clients that come to me with that very problem, and it really, I think my first advice is not to panic and to actually seek some proper advice there, and just look at where they are, because sometimes people might think they've made a bad decision and it's not going to they're not getting any growth on the property they have to sell. But I don't recommend you sell a property. In fact, I often don't recommend you sell a property at all unless you really need to, because the objective is to build up the portfolio. But you shouldn't really be selling the property unless you really have to. So selling for a loss is not really what you should be doing, unless that's going to put you in a better position. And sometimes it might. So you really need to look at that position. But if it's a location that's not getting you any growth, but you are getting, it's rented out and it's renting okay, and you've seen the broker or the bank and you're able to move forward with another purchase, then maybe that property can stay as part of your portfolio, and you'll be able to still move forward. So I bought a bit of a dud in Blackwater, which is fantastic at the time. I thought it was great as a ripper. For a few years, it was returning really good rental yields, and then things collapsed. But I've held that as I've absorbed that as part of my portfolio, and I'm hoping one day the market will bounce back enough for me to sell. Maybe at a profit. Won't be much of a profit given how much holding costs it's had, but that's kind of the goal. There might be situations where people do need to sell a property because they've got a dud, maybe even a couple of duds that they might need to sell before they can move forward, and that's the decision to actually have. But there's always a way forward, and I think that's what people need to understand. I have had some people come to me. They've got 6 or 8 properties. They're negatively geared in areas that they should actually be positively geared. So they've actually bought in regional areas, but just bought duds that just haven't worked very well. Or I've had people who have sort of been, they bought house and land packages and paid too much, and then 10 years later, the property's still not worth what they paid for it, and all sorts of things. So we need to assess that, and then assess whether you need to sell it, and whether your current cash reserves and your overall equity position allows you to be able to sell that and not get into further trouble, because the idea is to get yourself into further trouble. So the best thing to do is, definitely don't panic, get some good advice, and where possible, keep the property, because most of the time, most markets will recover eventually. So you might be buying in a bad location as such, but most locations will get some kind of growth over time, even those mining locations. So don't stress and be too worried about that. We've all made mistakes. I've made mistakes, and you just learn from that. But certainly don't get too grumpy about that, and certainly don't think that property doesn't work because you've bought in wrong location, or because your neighbour was at the barbecue and their cousin's mother bought a property somewhere and it didn't work. So you're not going to buy property because they got a dud. So don't let any of that put you off.
For those who are in this predicament, or possibly are heading down that path and might not even be aware at this point in time, what are, in your experience, some of the red flags that people need to look out for, that have invested into areas which it will happen in 4 to 5 years' time, possibly will not have given them the growth they want or the yield that they want?
Way too much land release, and probably not enough. I think when you invest in an area, if it's a new area, and there's nothing wrong with investing in new areas as long as there's infrastructure that's signed off on. If there's like a proposed new rail line or something there, make sure it's actually there before you invest there. I think the Western Sydney Airport, Badgerys Creek is an example. It's actually been signed off and they've started construction. So it's a really good area to be trying to get property in now, because it's going to really boom. But seeing that I've been talking about that for the last 50 years, that was not necessarily, guaranteed it before. So I'd be a bit careful of that. And Brisbane's the same. It's got lots of infrastructure that's promised, but some stuff hasn't been signed off on. So I'd be careful about buying in those kind of areas unless something's actually signed off on. But if you're buying where there's no scarcity, there's too much land, then that can provide a bit of a problem for you as well.
So what you're saying is look for areas which have not just the promise of infrastructure, look for areas which have something a bit more bankable.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure, yeah. And I think scarcity is always very important as well. So try to buy in established areas, or areas, even like new estates are okay, as long as you're not the first one to buy the first block of land. Buy in areas where the estate's already been built on, and you might be getting a block of land that's come back onto the market or something. So you're actually buying a new block of land, but it's become an infill area, not a greenfield. So I think that's really important.
Just going back to sort of the original question around people that are in a position where an investment hasn't quite materialized as they would have liked it to, and they're faced with that decision, the big decision of do we hold or fold. Would it be fair to say that if you can always afford to hold the asset, that you are better off to ride out a challenging market or a challenging situation? Or is it more dependent on their overall financial position and I guess bringing it back to strategy, because everything's opportunity cost, isn't it?
Everything's based on strategy and their financial position, and also like opportunity cost is important as well. So that's really important to think about as well. So I don't think just holding your property because if you can afford to is necessarily by itself, like in principle that sounds okay. But you really need to look at those other factors as well, because just holding the property just because you can afford to may not necessarily be the best approach to moving forward. So we need to look at everything from a holistic point of view, how we can move forward. And you might have 3 properties and one of them's a dud. Can we get your 4th, 5th, 6th property, or do we need to sell one before we can move on? So we need to look at that holistic approach.
That makes a lot of sense. And obviously we're not here having this conversation, giving anybody financial advice per se, but it is fair to say that there quite possibly could be instances where somebody might be better to absorb a small loss because that allows them to access that capital and reinvest it into a more lucrative opportunity. Is that sort of what?
Well, potentially, absolutely. And again, you need to, everyone needs to have a chat with if they've got a financial advisor or their broker. Because again, I don't, my job is to put a team of people around them. So I don't give financial advice myself, but we involve people.
Point them in the right direction.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think just to close off on location. In terms of trying to identify, I mean, we look at, we refer to the Sydney market because we're both recording this in Sydney at the moment. A lot of areas, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, partially through benefit of the market cycles we've seen. I mean, the sort of mid to late 2010s market, 2016, 17 was, some of the strongest selling conditions we've seen throughout the history of the country. Looking at areas which are going through the process of gentrification, so, attracting better quality people, new infrastructure, all the things that we've sort of covered off on. Is there any advice you can give people listening to help identify those areas, or is it basically just down to what we've sort of covered off on already?
Look, one of the things you really can do is when you're researching an area is really look at the government spending, the infrastructure that's going into an area, checking council websites. That always helps a lot. I mentioned what's happening at Badgerys Creek, Western Sydney Airport, up around the northwest area. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on out there, but just checking council websites. You can check out what sort of infrastructure is being planned and what's in the pipeline and everything like that, and that sort of helps with choosing the location. It's also quite good to be getting into areas where there's proposed zoning changes, and it's important to get into areas where there's actually proposed zoning changes, not just like, maybe it might happen one day, but if you know that council's looking at changing the zoning, which is actually going to be of benefit to you, where you might be able to buy a house, but you'll be able to build townhouses on the block in the future or something, then that might be of real benefit to you. So looking at those kind of things are really important. So that's where jumping on council websites, speaking to town planners should be all part of your due diligence process.
Very good. Well, I think we've covered off on the topic of location quite well. Those who are listening now probably have a really grounded view of what location means beyond the word itself, and we've also discussed that there's so many different aspects to what makes a location great or what makes a location not so great. Is there any closing comments, Lloyd, that you have in terms of the topic?
Look, all I can say there is that location is actually really, really important. So that should be one of the the first things you're looking at there. Once you've sort of decided on your strategy, looking at that location before you actually look at the actual property. So once you identify the type of location you want to get a property in, whether it's the Sydney markets and what suburbs, what areas, start actually learning about the location, about the actual your suburbs themselves. Before you actually look at a property. Don't just go and find a property in a location anywhere and just think, this looks like a good investment property. Go the other way around. Know all about the suburb itself, and then you can go into the micro factors within that suburb. That's
really great advice, Lloyd. So shop around on possibly region before isolating individual properties in that look appeal attractive or appear attractive. Really hone in on regions and all the benefits there. And then you can sort of dig deeper into the micro factors.
Totally, absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Lloyd.
Thanks, Alex. No problems at all.
So there you have it. Today's episode was all about location. Lloyd Edge puts a great emphasis on buying properties in great locations, which will allow you to achieve your financial goals and to ensure that your strategy holds you accountable to building a portfolio which will allow you to achieve financial freedom. Lloyd covers off on this topic in far greater detail in his new book, Positively Geared, available now for pre-sale with a 1st of April release date. I strongly recommend you get a copy of Lloyd's book so that you too can find your path to financial freedom.